I'm very excited to introduce our morning keynote, Dr. Michael Hathaway, all the way from British Columbia, Canada. So that's Canada's west coast. Basically as west as you can get in Canada. He's probably the most jet-lagged person here. A funny story actually about the first time I ever heard Michael talk. It was, well, I was working in Northern Canada and I was driving the car and Michael was being interviewed on CBC. That's the Canadian national broadcaster, and it's the show Quirks and Quarks. Highly recommend it. You can get it in podcast form. Really great show. And the thing about Northern Canada, let me just explain. So for about 500 kilometers, you hear nothing. There's no radio, you don't get cell reception. If your car breaks down, good luck. And then for about 100 kilometers around tiny towns, which constitute about 90% of the second largest country in the world, you actually get radio. And you hear two things. One is CBC, and the second is the country music station. And myself not being really that into country, I guess I had to listen to Michael. And it was great, actually. I was really fortunate. It was a very fortuitous encounter. Because Michael was actually talking about this book, which actually I have a copy of. This is my personal copy. What the Mushroom Lives For, Matsutake and the Worlds That They Make. Highly recommend it. Wonderful book. So Michael is a professor of anthropology at Simon Fraser University, associate member of the School of International Studies, and the director of the Simon Fraser University's David Lamb Center for Asian Studies. He's a 2022 Guggenheim Fellow, and yes, written and edited a few books. This one is the latest. Really great to read about world Nikken and Matsutake, especially on the Tibetan plateau. Through his career, Michael has spent a quarter of a century living, working, and traveling in China and increasingly in Japan, where he has explored the entangled and emergent worlds of transnational environmentalism, indigenous rights, and multi-species studies. The latter was part of the Matsutake Worlds Research Group, which is all about studies of Matsutake picking and commodity chains, and kind of shows the diverse cultures and ecologies that get entangled with that. So I am really happy for Michael to be here. Really excited he agreed to come all this way and do a talk entitled Fungal Liveliness, Forums into the Worlds of Mushrooms. So Michael, please. Yeah, sure. No, you don't have a PowerPoint. Right. I can just close this. Okay. Yeah, whatever. Okay. Good.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here today on this gorgeous morning. So I'm very grateful for Anna and Nisi for creating an event, and really for putting every little micro dynamic to make it happen. And I'm so glad to be reconnecting to some people that I've known from before, like Ursula and Allison, and then meeting almost all of you this time. So as you mentioned, I'm coming here from Oulu, from what is now called Vancouver in the province of British Columbia in Canada. And it's the home to 3 indigenous people, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And this is something actually in the last 5 or so years that we've started to do in this area of the world, is to acknowledge that territory. And so I was curious about coming to this place, what is the kind of history of these dynamics, and looking at maps of indigenous Sami territory. I see Oulu as lying south of that region, but wonder about their historical presence in these lands here. So when I was young, I accidentally came across a book in a used bookstore that began to intrigue me about Sami people and the fly agaric mushroom. It was a surprising volume in what was called the Golden Guide series. Now, the usual books in this series are about birds and reptiles, but here was a volume on hallucinogenic plants. It was something that quickly went out of press, and maybe it was a bit scandalous at the time. It was a fabulously illustrated book full of taboo and illegal plants and mushrooms. And I saw a story about Sami and other indigenous groups east to Siberia who would eat the fly agaric mushroom to participate in shamanic journeys. I was fascinated by a story about how people watched other animals, such as reindeer, who seemed to also seek out these hallucinogens, and how Sami learned to ingest these mushrooms, even recycling the urine of other fly agaric eaters using special wooden bowls. The story was that the first people eating the mushroom could act as filters in a way, taking out some of the negative effects of this mushroom while retaining some of its hallucinogenic properties. So in Vancouver, we don't know too much about indigenous relations to fungi, in part because many of the early colonists were British. As some of you heard last night in Alison's talk, England is a famously mycophobic nation. So the majority of British peoples feared fungi and were uninterested in eating them. This is an interesting puzzle, right? Because all around England, you have places like here, France, Russia, Germany, Italy, all these places where people really French. In Vancouver, we know far more about indigenous relations to plants for eating, for medicines, for ceremonies and everyday use than we do about fungi. But we are beginning to learn more and more with a new generation of fungi-curious people who asked the elders to pursue this topic. I think there's a lot to learn from people with such active engagements with the land and histories, that we might see and engage with the land and all the things upon it in different ways than how perhaps we were trained to see the world. So I was raised in a community that feared mushrooms, but then later for university, I went to Santa Cruz, California in the early 1990s, where I found a number of passionate mushroom hunters. And at that time there, I met Anna Singh, who probably many of you know, her book that was mentioned earlier, let's see, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And that was the beginning of what was called the Matsutake Research Group, which is Anna Singh and then a number of her former students or colleagues. And the idea was to travel around the world, including she came to Finland. We also went to Japan, Matsutake Global Market, and I led the research project in Southwest China. So that includes Liba Fair, Tim Choi, Shiho Satsuka, Miyako Inui, and myself. And so that was an amazing number of years where we did joint research in places, and we followed the this incredible commodity chain that came up into being. And for me, part of it was a shift about maybe 5 years ago, where I was thinking, how is it not just a commodity in and of itself that people can gather and use, but what are the qualities of the mushrooms themselves? What is their own sense of liveliness? And a term that I later ended up calling world making, its own perception of the world, its own kind of engagement. We had a question last night that's commissioners here this morning, but around the kind of desires or interests of other beings. And so that was something that I started to explore. And I come in part from a shared background in some ways with here around what's called STS or Science and Technology Studies. And from this view, we are curious about the ways that cultural understandings shape what counts as science. One of the main techniques from STS is to study the metaphors that scientists use and to tease out their implications. So this is really different from being a science writer or a science communicator, which is mainly trying to convert more technical and dry scientific jargon into language that a layperson could understand. In STS, we are also trying to focus on controversies within science and to look at the opposing sides and to see how they structure their arguments. When we see one side that might seem to win in a debate, we try to avoid assuming that they win because they are correct about the way that the world works. And so we try to hold off that last part with a bit of agnosticism. So in today's talk, I'd like for us to think about two dynamics that are connected to what I have just mentioned. First, I want to ponder a bit about why we are here to keep going with the theme for the day. And we are not just a group of mushroom lovers, above ground lovers of the underground, to play with Allison's book title. And here we are blessed with creative artists making new kinds of fungal materials and beautiful designs, as you see over there. And we have fungi growers and those trained in biology. We have filmmakers and even a few anthropologists. So some say that this is a mushroom moment, a mushroom renaissance. We started that conversation last night, but I would like to add a few ideas and hear about what you think, to take a step back and ask why it's happening and why it's happening very differently in different places. And then two, what kinds of pre-existing relations and histories does it draw on or engage with? And second, I'd like to briefly explore some of the legacies that I and others have been grappling with in terms of the science of fungi, more generally in broader scientific frameworks that undergird a lot of research. So, surprising to me, just a few weeks ago in Vancouver, some artist friends who work with mushrooms and have worked with a lot of schools were already being told by the school leaders that mushrooms are already passe. So it's fascinating, like it's like just beginning and then it's kind of moving on. And a friend at a university press said you can no longer put Anthropocene in the titles of books, like that time is done. So there's this kind of bizarre way in which there is a tendency to these fast moving trends and fads. This is a very powerful condition of Western society. And it forces us, I think, to think how deep are the changes that are happening or may happen down the road. And how do we want to play a role in that they won't just happen? So as many of you know, British Columbia, along with Washington and Oregon in the United States, are often called the Pacific Northwest. And they are likely one of the earliest and strongest centers of the Anglophone mushroom movement. In this region, when a lecture is announced by Paul Stamets, an American whose TED Talks are incredibly popular, he gets sell out quick. If you ever go to one of his shows, you'll see that when you get inside the atmosphere, it's a bit like the religious revival meeting with a charismatic preacher. He has really enchanted many with his hopes for mushrooms as a means to save the world, with helping bees fight disease, cleaning up oil spills, creating new breakthrough anti-cancer drugs, and so forth. And I like Allison's answer last night that was reiterated today to Honest Questions, where she is skeptical of mushrooms in and of themselves and what they will do, but interested in what the people like us and many others may do with fungi and microbes. So in my own town of Vancouver, as was mentioned last night, we have the biologist Suzanne Simard, who has scientific credentials and is also helping to ignite discussion for fungi. She did the groundbreaking research that was later called by others, an unknown editor of Finland magazine in 1997, as the Wood Wide Web. It's likely a term that many of you have heard. A story of connection between trees and fungi. In British Columbia, we have a long-standing love and a bit of a romance for trees, especially big trees and forests, something that I also suspect is at place here in Finland. Simard's concepts are also mobilized by environmentalists to challenge clear-cut logging, and especially cutting down some of the old growth forest. They draw on Simard's concept of the mother tree, which helped support so many others, sharing sugars created by photosynthesis and using the fungal network, now likened to our own internet, as a conduit to share nutrients between a mother and her young. As I will discuss later, Simard's work is not always accepted by her peers and part of a new round of scientific controversy. For a number of her claims about the forest and now energy flows through forest can challenge long-standing scientific conditions. And a close cousin to Simard might be the German forester, Peter Wolden, who had written 15 books that were read by few. Something changed in 2015. He wrote his 16th book. It's like a big shift. It was called The Hidden Life of Trees, which unexpectedly became a bestseller, first in Germany and then around the world. Both of his books and Samard's I saw the other day at Helsinki's academic bookstore. They're found there in English, showing their appeal in a broad right. A feature on him in the New Yorker magazine asked in the byline, does it matter if the books are full of questionable science? So in England, you have pundits such as Merlin Sheldrake, who enchanted us with stories of fungi, strange qualities, bringing a lyricism and a sense of gentle mystery to fungal lives. He and others such as Paul Stamets appear in a film, Fantastic Fungi, that uses animation to depict the magical seeming ways that fungi create their vast. There is this large outpouring of new fungi books and films. There are also wider dynamics at play, and it's harder to kind of get a sense of them or figure out their relative work. More fundamentally, I think that a big part of what is driving some of this broader shift is a loss of faith in notions of human progress. One of the central caveats was a faith that human ingenuity will allow us to solve all of the social and ecological problems of global capitalism. But now more and more of us are skeptical. So rather than a celebration of our medical advances, for example, many of us are now worried about the rise of bacterial resistance created by our own antibiotics, and a new concept, the idea of probiotics and beneficial bacteria, is now gaining ground. Of course, I think that dividing the world into beneficial and harmful bacteria is part of an older binary, a friend or foe, that doesn't allow us to think in more ecologically complex ways. The rise of interest in fungi, and especially the ways many are symbiotic, might also be connected to increasing acknowledgement from biologists such as Lynn Margulis, who came up with ideas of symbiosis that have been far more critical to life on Earth than previously understood by her peers. One of her radical ideas, which was first dismissed and now widely accepted, is that symbiosis is deeply inscribed in every eukaryotic cell. Margulis asserted that the mitochondria, the cell's powerhouse of energy production, might have been for a long time ago another organism that a larger cell tried to ingest but was unsuccessful. The result over long periods of time was that the ingested cell became a part of the larger cell and set up home. The propagation of some of these ideas, however, remains slow. They have rarely been incorporated into the kindergarten through grade 12 biology education in North America, where I live, where textbooks still give short shrift to symbiosis and pay little attention to fungi. Nonetheless, some students are finding out about these things on their own. I also wonder about the diverse potential roles of the COVID pandemic. Around the world, gardening, foraging for wild plants and mushrooms, and hiking soared in places where people weren't on strict stay-at-home rules. As difficult and tragic as things were for human health, this was a humbling phenomenon, where a virus that wasn't even considered biologically alive was able to so deeply transform human society across the planet. The pandemic exacerbated an already growing concern with climate change and the notion of the next mass extinction event. Within this overall sense of ecological despair, the story of mushrooms and their miraculous ways of being might have special appeal. Now, the growing love and fascination with mushrooms represents a massive transformation from the past, especially from within the Anglophone world. As Allison was saying last night, in English, the term mushrooms have often been associated with death and disease. And such a bias, I would say, has likely shaped over the long term scientific trends and studies. So just to say, give a few examples, over the last century, the vast bulk of studies in mycology have taken place within a pathogenic perspective, a study on disease. So within forestry, fungi have been more often studied in terms of disease than as organisms that could potentially bring health and vitality to forests. Fungi have been more often seen as agents that kill trees or eat out their heartwood, reducing their value as lumber. Within agriculture, Most studies of fungi have also been the source of disease. And even the most famous case of devastating food crops, like the potato famine of Ireland, was blamed on an organism that was first classified as a disease. This traumatic event, which resulted in the hunger, death, and migration of much of the Irish population, was pivotal. And here, as Allison mentioned last night, while we tend to focus on the mushroom-like disease as the cause here, we should remember that the whole situation was utterly and deeply shaped by a long legacy of English colonialism and the dispossession of the commons in a way that sometimes we just look at the mushroom itself as the pure agent of destruction. Nonetheless, this tragedy had many unforeseen effects that have circled the globe. It helped propel the notion that fungi were, in addition to insects, the greatest threats to our food supply. And I do recognize that fungi are still critical players in this food supply. And there are important diseases that live on the top 5 grains and tubers that constitutes the vast majority of our food: rice, wheat, potatoes, corn. These days, antifungal chemicals are increasingly used in agriculture, shaping whole ecologies, not only within the fields, but also beyond, spreading through air, water, and soil. Often broad spectrum fungicides that are likely changing the lives of many fungi, most of which are likely of unknown species with unknown consequences. Collectively, such actions are transforming ecological cycles, but in ways that are seriously under-examined or documented. To think about fungicides, we might consider a parallel transformation, the now massive and systemic use of antibiotics. As explored by Hannah Landecker, problems with antibiotics are usually framed in terms of human use and bacteria's growing resistance to these drugs. 2, this goes beyond their everyday use in growing the bodies of other animals, where similar problems are exacerbated by the ways industrial animal operations have become reliant on steady diets of antibiotics, feed our pigs, cows, chickens, and others, which also rapidly increases their weight gain. The rampant use of antibiotics has now become an ecological issue, as these pharmaceuticals are now unintentionally moving through watersheds, flowing in uneven ways, accumulating in some places and in some bodies, and restructuring the lives of many organisms. Likely, fungicides are doing the same. In 1952, Rachel Carson sounded the alarm about pesticides with her book, Silent Spring, creating much controversy and with much acclaim. This book stimulated lots of public and scientific attention to the unintended effects of pesticides in killing birds, including charismatic species such as the bald eagle. Yet, unlike the many millions who care for birds and pay deep attention to their lives, there are relatively few studies of changing fungal ecologies and fewer researchers trying to see how the flows of fungicides might be playing a role in changes. So I was originally thinking of my book, What a Mushroom Lives For, as a kind of antidote to what I was seeing as the rise of a mushroom romanticism that I saw in the. As a good academic, I was trained to think of romanticism as a kind of sentimentality that tended to oversimplify the world, a view with rose-colored glasses that might carry on its own unexamined problems. Yet in a conversation with a mycologist at Duke University, he challenged this view, saying for decades, although his work was well respected among his peers, hardly anyone in the broader public had much interest in fungi. Now, with retirement in sight, but still with lots of energy, this mycologist was delighted that so many people around him were now curious about the lives of the fungi that he had in turn devoted his whole life to. So he cautioned me about my sense of wanting to crush the. We talked about how truly fantastic fungi are as masters of alchemy. This is part of what makes them so powerful. They learned to digest wood, a complex chemical structure that eluded the ability of almost all other organisms for many millions of years. Some digest rock and hunt out tiny flecks of nutrient-bearing grains of sand underground. drilling into them with powerful chemicals to dissolve the minerals that bind them. Although when most of us think of fungi, we think of the big fleshy mushrooms that grow on the forest floor all around the paths here. Most fungi are unknown to science and invisible to the unaided human eye. Their bodies are so different from the usual images of what a body is, whether an animal such as a human, a dog, or a shark, or a tree, or many fungi are composed of threads which work their way through and within spaces, finding water and nutrients in places that from a plant root to become a barren desert, with incredible ability to find hidden resources. These underground networks of threads called hyphae can bridge different species of plants and fungi. The fruiting bodies, what we often see as mushrooms, are also knitted together from these same fibers, which miraculously can give them great strength and power to push aside leaves, rocks, and even pavement. Within these fruiting bodies, these are amazing and diverse structures that are often powered by moisture and can catapult spores off into space. With more G-forces than an astronaut faces in a spaceship, spores are often shot out from the mushroom gills. The structures and actions of these fungal bodies can create their own wind, helping to carry spores. As lively beings, fungi are connectors across kingdoms of life. They form an active bridge between the realms of the living and the dead. They help turn the great cycles of life, such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We have often remained stuck in a two-kingdom model of life, plants and animals, and still many continue to assign fungi to the world. Or even the fruiting body itself is a term that comes from the fact or hearing about the ways that agricultural inspectors then deal with people raising fungi on the farms and ask about the kinds of crop rotation, other kinds of agricultural metaphors that have no bearing. As Allison said last night, fungi destabilize many of the binaries that we have inherited. Some have tens of thousands of mating types and not just two. The fungi might not have pre-programmed cell death, and thus they might not be part of the cycles of predictable youth, maturity, and death that we have often assumed was inevitable fact of life. They gain energy through forms of dissolving materials with alchemical. For the remainder of my talk, I want to briefly discuss some of the ways that I've been thinking about the forms of science that we have inherited, such as the concepts of anthropomorphism, and how this might be tied to the dominance of mechanistic understandings of the world. This is kind of drawing from the STS kind of background that I was mentioning. So the term anthropomorphism gets a lot of attention in discussions about the proper boundaries of science. Writers such as Peter Wohlleben and Suzanne Simard often accuse such a violation of scientific practices that would rigorously avoid such language. Although I think it is true that the writing does this, I suggest that we might want to look more carefully at a range of statements they make, rather than talk about them in general. Think about the particular claim. I would also like to think for a moment about a term that doesn't receive, in my view, sufficient attention. That term is mechanicomorphism. So I first came across this term in a book by one of the famous primatologists, Frans de Waal, who was pointing out its dominance in limitations. In his more recent work, de Waal is starting to more directly look at and challenge some of the assumptions of human exceptionalism that are often found. These assumptions of exceptionalism takes a number of forms, such as the idea that emotional capacity is only found in humans. So basically, de Waal talks about how the kind of standard way of talking about how organisms function in the world is to imagine them as little machines. And that has become, even though it is deeply questionable in a number of ways, that has become the default mode of description and analysis. I just want to make the point too that with charges of anthropomorphism, critics are asserting that a certain quality is found only in humans. It is a trait or quality that only humans have. And this often happens without testing that claim themselves. Is it actually a quality or trait that is found throughout other animals? Or carefully consulting the published literature. So sometimes too, there's a kind of knee-jerk kind of accusation of a certain claim as being when in fact it is referring to a wider dynamic that humans share with many other animals. So let's think a little bit about the kind of history of the mechanistic way of thinking. For various reasons, the notion that all organisms exist in machine-like ways has gained scientific dominance over the last few centuries. If you haven't yet read the 2016 book by the historian of science, Jessica Riskin, The Restless Clock, A History of the Centuries-Long Argument Over What Makes Living Things Tick, I recommend it for those who want to learn about how people, who are often called natural historians, end up arguing for a certain understanding of non-human beings that deny them any capacity for choice. Riskin reminds us that the term scientist wasn't even used in print until as late as 1834, so we are dealing with some very recent dynamics. Although sometimes a massive shift in Western science is assumed to have been created all at once with the Enlightenment period, things change more gradually, according to this. Charles Darwin, for example, conducted experiments in which he approached other organisms, such as worms, as lively beings who possess forms of mysterious intelligence and to learn from their experiences. Nonetheless, an increasing number of scientists began to use a mechanistic framework. It was a long battle, though, that took place over centuries, and two groups began to emerge. One group saw organisms as agentive, self-making machines. And indeed, they coined that term organism to refer to the idea that the animal is self-organized as opposed to being a mere machine. So I really like how this very term, which is often now today seen as a neutral term, was actually invented to advocate for certain argument, certain debate that's now largely forgotten. The other group saw organisms, in the non-political sense of the term, as more passive and subject to the. By the 1930s, however, this battle had basically been won by the more passive-minded group, later termed the neo-Darwinists. Today, nearly a century later, the conceptual framework of the field of biology continues to be almost exclusively a mechanistic view. Although in everyday life, many biologists appreciate the organisms they work with as lively. The constraints on scientific writing tend to produce accounts described in exclusively mechanistic terms. As Eileen Christ shows, standard biological texts use mechanistic language to portray, quote, animals as objects who appear blind to the meaning and significance of their activities and interactions. Behavior comes through as something that happens to an animal rather than an active. So that was a really interesting insight for me to read, to rethink some of these portrayals of animal behavior, and you're going to see how this is part of the wider frame. And I would say that this mechanistic understanding has been incredibly productive for scientific discovery in several ways. For example, viewing animals as machine-like meant that they were perceived as not feeling pain or possessing rights. Hence, moral questions could be disregarded, and a wide array of experiments from limb amputation to vivisection could be carried out. The goal of a mechanistic view is to discover the mechanisms of life, the relations of cause and effect. In fact, the term the mechanism is a common way to describe such connections. The main query of a mechanistic framework is always at base, what is the mechanism? This question, though useful in many cases, also excludes many other lines of inquiry by, on the one hand, assuming a mechanism both exists and controls such relation, and on the other, by assuming that the question of a mechanism is in and of itself the most important question. I think the historical consequences have been unimaginably important and yet little acknowledged or reckoned with. In my own book and larger work, I think I've engaged with some of these implications. I'm not arguing that mechanical ways of imagining the world are inherently wrong, but trying to see how they shape the very grounds of experiments and even the practice. I am also interested in some of the implicit assumptions that guide this discussions. For example, some scientists that even say that using the term to decide that an organism can decide any course of action is itself. And others think that some animals have an ability to decide actions, but that this ability is not widespread or goes beyond other things. And some of the botanists that Michael Hathaway talked with argued decision-making requires free will, which is also another interesting set of expectations. Equality is often assumed to be possessed only by humans. But as an anthropologist, many of us are skeptical that free will as a kind of individual sentiment might even apply to humans, although it is an important recent concept. So to end my talk for today and to open things up for questions, I would like to leave you with a few questions and provocations. What do you see as contributing to the rise of this mushroom renaissance? What could enable it to have lasting impact? And what would you like to see happen? You're here to think about mushroom methods and what kinds of qualities might mushrooms possess that can help us dissolve as they dissolve forms of life. Some of the more stubborn impediments to forms of thinking that might be able to involve new forms of creative rigor. Thank you for